Driftless Area, Wisconsin, October 1884. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of curing oak leaves and the promise of a killing cold to come. On a small plot of land carved from the rolling hills, Jan Kovář was digging. He wasn't clearing a field or digging a root cellar. He was excavating a precise, rectangular pit directly in front of his modest cabin, right where the porch was meant to be. The hole was peculiar. 3 feet deep, 4 feet wide, and running the 10-foot length of the cabin's front wall. To the men who stopped to watch, it made no sense at all. Silas Boone, the carpenter hired to frame the porch, stood with his hands on his hips, his face a mask of professional disbelief. Boone was a man who understood wood. He knew the grain of oak, the heft of pine, and the unyielding geometry of a plumb line and a square. He built things to last, to stand firm against the crushing weight of Wisconsin snow. And this hole was an offense to his craft. "What in God's name is that for, Kovář?" Boone asked, his voice rough as unfinished lumber. "You mean to build a porch over a trench? The frost will heave it to splinters by January." Jan Kovář straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He was a man of medium height, with quiet eyes and a steady, unhurried way of moving. He simply looked at the hole, then at the carpenter. "For the cold," he said, his English thick with a bohemian accent. A snort of derision came from Arthur Finch, a farmer whose land bordered Jan's. "For the cold? You mean to bury it?" Laughter rumbled through the small group of onlookers. "It's foolishness," Boone declared, speaking to the others as if Jan wasn't there. "The ground here freezes 5 feet deep. A hole just collects water, which turns to ice, which will pop your foundation posts right out of the earth. I've built 50 houses in this county. I know what I'm talking about. I won't build on a foundation that's designed to fail." He shook his head, a final verdict delivered. "The man's gone mad from the loneliness out here." Jan offered no argument. He didn't try to explain the currents of air, the weight of a winter night, or the memory of lagering cellars in his homeland. He just picked up his shovel and plunged it back into the dark Wisconsin soil. The mockery of his neighbors was a quiet hum behind the rhythmic scrape of steel on rock. What did this bohemian brewer understand about the physics of convection that a master carpenter, a man who had fought the Wisconsin winter his entire life, had missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of the past. The stories of quiet innovators who solved impossible problems with nothing but observation and a deep understanding of the natural world. If you believe that ingenuity is more powerful than convention, subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. I promise you will learn the simple, powerful physics of how cold air moves and how one man tamed it not with fire, but with a hole in the ground. Let us know in the comments, what's the most counterintuitive solution you've ever seen work? Jan Kovář was not a builder. He was not a farmer, not a frontiersman. In the old world, his hands had never framed a wall or split a rail. His domain had been the cool, damp dark of a brewery cellar in Plzeň. He was a man who understood the subtle alchemy of barley, hops, water, and yeast. His expertise lay in the precise control of temperature, in the patient management of fermentation that could be ruined by a single degree of variance. He had spent 2 decades working not with wood, but with the massive copper kettles, the heavy oak barrels, and the slow, invisible river of cold air that flowed through the stone lagering caves deep beneath the city. He knew in his bones that cold air was not a presence, but a substance. It had weight. It had direction. It flowed. And like water, it would always seek the lowest point. This knowledge was useless, it seemed, in Wisconsin. Here, survival was measured in cords of wood and the thickness of one's walls. When Jan, his wife Anichka, and their two children, Jakob and Eva, survived their first winter in 1883. They did so barely. Their cabin, built to the exact standards Silas Boone championed, was a fortress of logs, chinked with mud and moss. It was also a torture chamber of cold. The problem wasn't the walls, it was the floor. A relentless, invisible seepage of cold radiated up from the floorboards. Anichka kept a pot of coffee on the stove all day. But if she poured a cup and set it on the small table, it would be cool in minutes, the ceramic leaching warmth into the air. At night, they would wake to find a thin film of ice had formed on the surface of the water bucket, just 10 feet from the glowing stove. The worst of it was the drafts. Not the howling gales that attacked the windows, but a silent, ankle-high current of frigid air that snaked across the floor. It was a physical presence, a malevolent spirit of the cold that no amount of chinking could stop. They stuffed rags into every crack they could find, but the cold river still flowed. The children, Jakob and Eva, were never without coughs, their feet always cold despite the thick wool socks Anichka knitted. Jan burned through his woodpile at an alarming rate, the stove glowing red-hot, yet the floor remained a sheet of ice. He knew then that the fight was not with the wind outside. It was with the pool of cold living inside. The conventional wisdom of the driftless area was robust, time-tested, and in the face of a truly brutal winter, tragically flawed. Silas Boone and men like him built strong cabins. They used seasoned oak for the foundation sills, white pine for the walls, and cedar shakes for the roof. The logic was simple: mass and tightness. A thick wall, they believed, was a warm wall. A well-chinked log would stop the wind. This was all true, but it addressed the wrong enemy. The primary failure of these cabins wasn't heat loss through the walls, conduction, or even drafts from outside. The true failure was a misunderstanding of convection. Inside every cabin, a simple, powerful engine was at work. The cast-iron stove radiated heat, warming the air around it. This warm air, being less dense, rose to the ceiling. As it moved across the ceiling and toward the colder outer walls, it cooled, became denser, and sank. This created a continuous, slow-moving loop of air. The warmest part of the cabin was always near the ceiling. The coldest was always on the floor. This phenomenon was made exponentially worse by the construction of the floor itself. The floorboards were laid over joists, which sat on a foundation of stacked fieldstone. This created a crawl space underneath the house. In winter, this crawl space became a reservoir of Arctic air. Air at -20 degrees Fahrenheit is nearly 10% denser than the 70-degree air inside the cabin. This dense, heavy air sat directly against the underside of the thin floorboards, constantly pulling heat out of them. The floor became the single largest and most effective cold surface in the entire house. The result was misery. In the Albright cabin, a quarter-mile down the creek, Martha Albright spent her days shuffling her feet, never standing still, to keep the blood moving. Her husband Thomas said their floor was so cold the nails would pop with a sound like a pistol shot in the dead of night. At the Sutton place, their youngest child was confined to his cradle, which they had raised up on blocks to get him 2 feet above the deadly river of cold that flowed across their floor. They burned wood with a desperate fury, turning their stove into a miniature blast furnace. But they were only heating the top half of their home. The bottom 12 inches remained in a permanent state of winter. The problem wasn't their stove or their insulation. The problem was gravity, acting on the very air they breathed. They were living on the shore of a frozen lake that filled their home from the floor up. Jan began the construction of his strange foundation in defiance of all local knowledge. Silas Boone, contractually obligated to build the porch, did so with vocal protest. He refused to have any part in the foundation itself. "I'll frame the top, Kovář, But when that hole of yours causes it to collapse, my name won't be on the stonework. I'm a carpenter, not a gravedigger. So Jan worked alone. He spent a week lining the pit with flat field stones, creating a neat, stable basin. He did not use mortar. The stones were dry stacked, allowing any moisture to weep away into the soil. This was his first departure from local practice, which would have demanded a solid, mortared wall that would have trapped water and been destroyed by ice. Next, he set the 6 locust posts that would support the porch, placing them carefully on flat foundation stones set well back from the edges of the pit. He packed the earth around them, tamping it down until they were as solid as the ancient oaks on the ridge. Boone watched this, arms crossed, and grunted a grudging approval. The posts are set right, I'll give you that. It's what's between them that's madness. The final, crucial element was the skirting. Once Boone and his apprentice had framed the porch deck, a simple structure of pine joists and planking, Jan took rough-sawn hemlock boards and nailed them vertically from the edge of the porch deck down to the ground. He enclosed the entire space beneath the porch, leaving no gaps. On the side facing the prevailing winter wind, he made the skirting even tighter, overlapping the boards. He had not built a crawl space. He had built a sealed, sunken chamber. His wife Anichka watched with a worried frown. She trusted Jan's mind, but she also heard the laughter from the neighbors. "Jan, Mr. Boone says the porch will sag into your pit," she said one evening, her voice quiet. Jan paused from sharpening his axe, the whetstone making a soft shushing sound. He looked at her, his expression calm. "In the cellar, Anichka, the cold air falls into the drainage channels. It stays there. The warmer air above where the barrels are is still. It is the same principle. The cold must have a place to go. We will give it a home, but not in our house." He smiled faintly. "It is a cellar for the cold." The skepticism was relentless. Elias Thorne, who ran the local grist mill, stopped by one day. "Heard you built yourself an ice box under your porch, Kovář. Planning on selling block ice come summer?" Jan simply nodded. "Perhaps." His minimal responses were more frustrating to the mockers than any argument. He refused to be drawn into a debate. His work was his only statement. The porch was finished by late October. It looked ordinary, solid, but beneath it, hidden by the hemlock skirt, lay the silent, waiting trench, Jan Kovář's radical, foolish, and deeply misunderstood idea. To understand the genius of what Jan had built, one must understand the physics of what he was fighting. It all comes down to a single principle. Cold air is heavy. Heat is the vibration of molecules. When air is heated, its molecules move faster, spread out, and the air becomes less dense, causing it to rise. When air is cooled, its molecules slow down, pack closer together, and the air becomes denser, causing it to sink. This is convection. Imagine pouring a bucket of water onto a flat surface. It spreads out, seeking the lowest level. Now imagine that water is the dense, minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit air of a Wisconsin winter night. It flows across the landscape and meets the foundation of a house. With a conventional crawl space, the quinquential spaces, this heavy, cold air simply pools underneath the floor. The floorboards, typically only an inch thick, are all that separates the living space from this reservoir of Arctic cold. The heat from inside the house is constantly being pulled down through the floor into this cold sink. The process is called conductive heat transfer. The stove can run all day, but it's fighting a losing battle against a floor that is being actively refrigerated from below. Jan Kovář's sub-porch cold trap was not a barrier. It was a diversion. It was a piece of thermal jujitsu. The hemlock skirting around the porch acted as a dam, guiding the heavy, cold air that would normally flow into the crawl space. As this dense air hit the skirting, its momentum carried it downwards, But instead of pooling against the foundation of the house itself, it found a lower point, Jan's 3-foot-deep pit. Like water flowing into a ditch, the coldest, densest air cascaded over the edge and settled at the bottom of the trench. This process was continuous. As more cold air arrived, it would fill the pit from the bottom up. The air that eventually did come into contact with the house's foundation was not the coldest, densest air from the outside. It was the slightly less cold air that sat on top of the super-chilled pocket in the pit. Jan had created a buffer zone. He had intercepted the enemy, the densest, coldest air, and trapped it before it could ever reach the underside of his floor. He had dug a riverbed and invited the river of cold to flow into it, leaving his home like an island of calm in the middle of the current. It was an astonishingly elegant solution that required no extra fuel, no complex machinery, only a deep understanding of a force as old as the earth itself. That winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invading army. A mass of Arctic air descended from Canada and settled over the upper Midwest, locking the driftless area in a vice of historic cold. For 10 consecutive nights, the mercury in the thermometer outside the general store did not rise above -25 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind stopped. The air became crystalline and still, so cold it seemed to have a sound, a high, thin ringing. Trees on the ridges cracked with reports like rifle shots as their sap froze and expanded. It was a cold that tested the limits of every living thing. For most settlers, it was a period of pure survival. At the Albright cabin, they hung blankets over the doors and windows and moved their beds as close to the stove as they dared. Still, the cold crept in. A skin of ice formed on the inside of their log walls. When Martha spilled a ladle of water on the floor, it didn't just freeze, it cracked as it froze, the ice sheet contracting in the brutal cold. They burned through a week's worth of wood in 2 days, the stove roaring, its metal sides glowing a dull cherry red. Yet 10 feet away, their breath plumed in the air. It was a similar story across the valley. Silas Boone, in his own well-built home, found his morning routine altered. He had to chip his shaving soap out of its mug with a knife. His hands, even indoors, were stiff and aching. He wore his thickest coat to eat breakfast, his feet numb on the frigid floorboards. This was the price of a Wisconsin winter, he thought. It was a thing to be endured, a battle of attrition. But at the Kovář cabin, something was different. The stillness outside was matched by a stillness inside. Jan kept the stove fed with a steady, moderate supply of oak, never needing to push it to its roaring limits. The air inside was cool, but not cold. And the floor? The floor was the miracle. It was not warm, but it was neutral. It did not radiate cold. It did not steal the heat from your feet. The proof was in the small details of domestic life, the things made possible by the absence of cold. Anichka found she could leave a ball of butter on the kitchen table overnight, and in the morning it was still soft enough to spread on their bread. This was an unheard-of luxury. Young Ava, who was learning to sew, could sit on a rag rug on the floor, her small fingers working a needle and thread without growing stiff and blue. And Jakub, a quiet boy of 10, spent hours on that same floor, carefully carving a small wooden bird, the shavings piling up around him. He did so in his shirt sleeves. They were not just surviving the cold, they were living normal lives within it. The Kovář cabin had become an embassy of a gentler climate, right in the heart of the Arctic freeze. Their fortress wasn't in their walls. It was in the empty space beneath their porch. The vindication came on the 7th day of the deep freeze. Silas Boone was trying to repair the runner on his sled, which had cracked in the brittle cold. Working outside was a misery. His tools were painful to touch, the metal sucking the life from his fingers. In a moment of clumsy frustration, his hands numb and stiff, he dropped his favorite froe. A heavy, specialized tool for splitting wood. It bounced once and skittered under the skirt of Jan Kovář's porch. Boone swore, the curse word turning to a puff of white vapor. He got down on his hands and knees, grumbling about the bohemian and his foolish ideas. He expected to be met with the familiar, knife-like draft that whipped under every structure in the county, a concentrated blast of pure winter. He braced himself, pulling his collar tight, and reached his bare hand under the hemlock skirting. The sensation stopped him cold. It was utterly wrong. There was no draft, no movement of air at all. Instead, his fingers entered a layer of air so profoundly, unnaturally still, and so bitingly cold, it felt like plunging his hand into a bucket of ice water. It was a dead, heavy cold, colder than the ambient air around him, but just inches above this shocking layer. As his arm reached further, the underside of the porch floorboards felt calm. They were cold, yes, but they weren't radiating that life-leeching frigidity. The air around them was still. The violent cold was being held, somehow, in a pool beneath them. He pulled his hand out as if burned, and stared at his reddened fingers. He couldn't make sense of it. He reached in again, this time more slowly, like a man testing the water of a strange pond. There it was again, a clear, sharp line of demarcation. Below, a reservoir of intense, motionless cold. Above, a zone of neutral, still air. The floor of the porch was not sitting in the cold. It was floating above it. Stunned, Silas Boone got to his feet. He walked to the front of the porch, where a small gap in the skirting let him peer down into the pit. What he saw finally broke through his years of certainty. The stones at the bottom of the trench were coated in a delicate, feathery layer of white frost, sparkling in the pale afternoon light. The trapped moisture in the air had frozen onto the coldest surfaces. But the pine boards of the porch deck, directly above this glittering frost, were bare. They were dry and clean. The cold had found its home at the bottom of the pit, and it had stayed there. He stood there for a long time, the frozen sled forgotten. He looked from the frost in the pit to the quiet plume of smoke rising from the Kovář chimney, a calm, steady plume, not the frantic, belching smoke of a stove being pushed to its limit. Later that day, he walked to Jan's door and knocked. When the brewer answered, Boone didn't offer an apology or an excuse. He was a practical man, and he had seen practical proof. He simply looked at Jan, his face stripped of its usual arrogance, and spoke with a tone of quiet awe. "Kovář," he said, his voice raspy in the cold air. "I was wrong." He gestured toward the porch. "You didn't build a porch foundation. You built a riverbed for the cold." Jan Kovář merely nodded, his eyes showing no triumph, only understanding. "The cold must go somewhere," he said. "Better in the ground than in my house." News in the frontier traveled not by paper, but by word of mouth, carried by practical people who valued results over theory. Silas Boone, the loudest critic, became the innovation's most powerful advocate. His conversion was absolute because it was based on sensory evidence, not persuasion. The following spring, when a group of businessmen planned to build a new tavern in Prairie du Chien, they hired Boone to oversee the construction. At the planning meeting, he unrolled the blueprints and immediately took a pencil to the foundation plan. "This is wrong," he announced. The investors looked at him, surprised. "You're planning a standard crawl space. Your patrons' feet will be frozen from November to March, and you'll burn a forest trying to keep the place warm." He then described in precise carpenter's terms the sub-porch cold trap he had seen at the Kovář place. He called it a cold sink. They were skeptical, but Boone's reputation was unassailable. "I saw it work through the worst freeze in 30 years, he told them. "Learned it from a Bohemian brewer. He understands how air moves." They agreed to the modification. The new tavern was built with a 4-foot-deep rock-lined trench running the length of its front and western walls, the ones facing the winter winds. That next winter, the tavern became famous not for its whiskey, but for its warmth. Patrons marveled that they could sit at a table near the wall and not feel a single draft. The floor was comfortable. The owner reported to Boone that he was burning nearly a third less wood than a comparable tavern down the river. The Kovář cold trap, filtered through Silas Boone's practical advocacy, began to spread. By 1890, at least a dozen new structures in the county, from farmhouses to small churches, were built with a variation of the sunken trench. It was a quiet revolution, a piece of old-world wisdom taking root in the harsh soil of the new. Jan Kovář's simple trench was a brilliant piece of frontier engineering, but it was also a precursor to some of the most advanced concepts in modern building science. A century before terms like passive house and thermal break entered the lexicon, Jan was manipulating air density and pressure to create a comfortable living space. His skirting acted as an air barrier, and the pit itself was a form of passive heat exchange system, or more accurately, a cold exchange system. He was managing the building's microclimate by fundamentally redesigning its relationship with the ground and the air around it. He proved that sometimes the most effective way to deal with an overwhelming force isn't to build a bigger wall, but to dig a smarter hole. The lesson of the cold trap is a profound one, extending far beyond the realm of construction. The frontier ethos was one of confrontation. Settlers fought the prairie, fought the forest, fought the winter. They met force with greater force, burning more wood, building thicker walls, enduring the hardship as a badge of honor. Jan Kovář's approach, born from a brewer's patience, was entirely different. It was not a battle. It was an accommodation. He did not try to vanquish the cold. He recognized it as a fundamental, immovable force of nature. He studied its character, its weight, its tendency to fall. And then he simply stepped aside and offered it a more appealing path. He yielded to its nature and, in doing so, neutralized its power over him. The core principle was not to block the cold, but to define its place. Cold kept in place cannot take yours. It's a lesson in physics, but also in wisdom. Some of life's greatest struggles are won not by resistance, but by intelligent diversion. By understanding the nature of the force against you, you can carve out a place of warmth and peace, not by defeating it, but by letting it flow harmlessly by. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet ingenuity. If you believe these forgotten histories hold valuable lessons for the present, please support our work by subscribing to the channel and liking this video. We're passionate about bringing these stories to light. Let us know in the comments, have you ever seen a simple old-world solution to a modern problem? We read everyone. Disclaimer. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.